Today, I'm going to cover 5 sampling mistakes that you might be making that are hurting your beats. First off, one of the most common sampling mistakes that I see many producers make is frequency alteration. Now this isn't inherently a bad thing. When you're using samples, using things like EQs and changing the frequencies of your samples is something that's oftentimes a good idea. But the problem comes when we lose control of just how much we're altering the frequencies of our sample and how much damage that can do to our beats. So for instance, let's take a listen to this beat that I just started here. Now this beat here sounds pretty full, and you can see if I were to pop open my EQ that I have on this sample, I did some frequency alterations here. I reduced some of that high end and I also reduced the low end, but I did this in a bit more of a detailed way in the low end. You can see right here we have this very particular cut. The reason why I created this, hopefully you can hear this, is that we have this ugly frequency that comes through in this loop. Hopefully you heard it. I'll repeat this a few times. We have that ugly tone in the sample, and so what I did was I used my EQ and I tried to be a bit more precise and cut in order to remove that ugly tone from out of the sample. But a problem I see very often is that when producers are faced with problems like this, when their samples have frequencies that they do not want in their beat, or furthermore, their samples have frequencies that they don't need, like in the low end if they want to create their own bass line, what they end up doing is excessively cutting frequencies. So in this scenario, let's say I heard that ugly tone and I thought, well, I'm planning on adding my own bass tone, which will take up a similar space anyways. I'm just gonna go ahead and reduce this entire space in the low end. So let's take a listen to how this beat would sound like this. This beat now sounds like it's missing a pretty vital space in that low mid, and it starts to feel like the beat is not really as complete now. And this exact same type of thing happens when producers pitch up their samples. I know a lot of people are fans of that older sped up soul where you pitch up your samples like Kanye. But doing this excessively will present this exact same type of problem. What happens is that we shift our entire frequency spectrum of our sample up when we repitch our samples higher. And this might end up leaving spaces in your beats that are completely empty because your sample will sit in too high of a space and your bass will sit in too low of a space, leaving a gap missing right in between them. And as you know, it's going to be important to have a good even distribution of frequencies in your beat in order to get them to sound full and complete. So when it comes to sampling, be a bit more meticulous with your frequency alterations and understand how big of an impact it can have in your production. If you're thinking of drastically reducing the frequencies of your sample, this type of technique might be better when you're trying to use your sample in a supplemental fashion rather than the primary layer in your beat. And for those of you that watched my prior video a while back on advanced sampling techniques, you saw me do that exact same type of thing in that video. Sampling sin number 2, we have excessive repetition. So let's take a listen to this other beat that I've also just started here. And as you can see, in order to build this loop, I just used 4 chops here. This helped me create this very seamless sounding loop that works with this beat idea. But oftentimes I will see beat makers do something like this. Now I want to start by saying using a lot of chops to build out your loop isn't inherently a bad thing once again. I would say a bigger question that needs to be asked is why? Why is it that you're using a lot of excessive and repetitive chops? A lot of the times I think producers almost feel compelled to make patterns like this because they feel that using longer chops like I have here, it almost feels like cheating and it's too simple. They don't feel like they've done enough in their beat. So what they decide to do is to create something like this so they actually felt like they did something now. The problem here is that I would argue this probably isn't the best possible usage of your sample, and oftentimes there are better ideas that you could go for if you're just a little bit more technically basic. Now there is a time for this type of repetitive and excessive chopping style. For those of you that remember my video I made a little while back on 3 sampling techniques that you can use for your beats, I showed you a beat that used somewhat of a similar repetitive chopping style like this, but there is a difference that has to do with musicality, which leads me to sin number 3. The loss of musicality with this style of sampling. With this pattern here, again, let's take a listen. What producers can forget when using samples is that we are still making music, and a lot of these pieces that we chopped up are musical notes here. So with a pattern like this here, this would be the musical equivalent to making a pattern that sounds like this. Now if this was all I did to build out the music for my beat and I expected just this small little musical phrase to carry the entire beat, I would argue that this is probably not going to end well. For those of you that watched the sampling video that I referred to prior, you'll remember that I built other musical ideas around my sample in order to get my beat to sound full and complete. But a big mistake that I will often hear with producers is that they will create a basic musical idea like this with their sample, and that will be it for their beat. They won't bother building anything around this musically. So if you plan on using just your sample to provide the musicality in your beat, this is going to be fine as long as you actually use the parts of your sample that are a bit more musical, like I did with this pattern right here. As you can hear in this example, I made sure to choose parts of the sample that actually had more music within each chop. You can hear as I play through these chops, it's not as if these are simple one-note phrases. These chops have multiple notes within each of them, and I just piece them together. Which is why I could probably get away with depending on just this loop to provide the musical framework for my beat and still end up with a complete sounding beat. Sin number 4, this one's kind of a strange one that I've seen from time to time, and that's the idea of sacred sampling. In some of my older sampling videos, I had a few commenters actually get mad at me because I would really pull apart and change the samples to help them fit my beat. I'd add a lot of different effects to the point where the sample didn't really sound like the original anymore. And these commenters got upset because according to them, I wasn't being respectful to the original song and maintaining the integrity of what kept that original song so special. Now you might feel this way and that's fine, but I would argue that this type of approach to sampling is again leaving a lot of good ideas on the table. It'd be like me saying that you shouldn't change presets and play around with the parameters and add effects because that would be disrespectful to the preset creators. At the end of the day, these are all just tools that you can use to build out your beats. And if changing your samples is going to better fit your beat and result in a better beat in the end, I would encourage it. For example, if I didn't change how this sample sounded and I kept it as it was with this beat, you can hear the difference. The sample just became a lot smaller and takes up a lot less space in the beat, which again is going to force me to add a lot more layers into this beat to get it to sound full. And at that point, we're playing a dangerous game of possibly cluttering our beats with excessive sounds, which is why I added all of these effects right here in order to help improve my sample. So if you're someone who thinks that in order to sample well, you need to keep the sample as close to the original as possible, just know that you're probably doing so at the expense of your beat and how good it potentially could be. And finally, sin number 5, this has to do with poor sample selection. One thing that took me years to learn is that when it comes to sampling, just because it's a good song doesn't mean it's a good sample. This is a huge lesson that I think is really important. A lot of times I would hear these amazing songs and think, well, I want to make a beat out of that. But the problem is that oftentimes they were already full songs. For example, if I decided to try and make a beat out of this, the sample already has a ton of instrumentation as well as a singer singing on top. If I wanted to make a beat out of this, I would have to work really hard around all of this huge instrumentation. Now by all means, it's still going to be possible to use this sample and make something out of it, but the tools and the techniques that are going to be available to create something out of this are going to be far more limited. And this type of sample selection also contributes to the problem that we saw in the very first tip A lot of the times producers will try to isolate certain instruments with EQs and shaping tools. What ends up happening is that the sounds that you want are barely audible, and there are other muffled instrumentation that you couldn't remove out of the sample. They're just playing all over the place. This is again going to result in a lot of difficulty when you try to use samples. And this is exactly why I always advocate for using more open samples, especially when you first start out. It'll just give you a lot more flexibility to try out different techniques and add your own sounds on top, as opposed to a sample that's already very full, at which point it becomes a lot harder to contort and change things around to fit the needs of your beat, and you're mainly just left with chopping and rearranging as your main tools for sampling, making your job a lot more difficult at times. So those are the big 5 sampling sins that I often see. If you are interested in learning some more actual sampling techniques though, check out the video that I made on that. The link should be showing up on the screen right now. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Head over to betterbeatmaker.com if you need some more advanced help with your beats. My free drum kit's available in the description box below, as well as a link to the Discord if you want to join my producer community, and I will see you guys next time.